Hi, welcome. We are here today with Neil Gross and Eric Jones to talk about Neil's new book, Walk the Walk, How Three Police Chiefs Defied the Odds and Changed Cop Culture. It's out today and had a nice write-up in the New York Times. My name is Justin Fenton. I'm a reporter with the Baltimore Banner, formerly with the Baltimore Sun. I wrote a book too about police culture. It's called We Own This City and came out a couple of years ago. I want to first thank the Niskanen Center for hosting this event. We're going to have some Q&A with the author, a Q&A with Eric Jones, and then we will take questions from the audience towards the end. So first I will introduce Neil. He is a former patrol officer in the police department in Berkeley, California, and a professor of sociology at Colby College. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times and an author of 2 previous books. Also joining us is Eric Jones, currently the Deputy County Executive for Sacramento County. He began his career in policing at the Stockton Police Department in 1993, rising to the rank of police chief in 2012, a position he held until 2022 when he left for his current position. Again, you can ask questions now in the Q&A window, and we will pose them to our guests here. But first, Neil, let's talk about your background, policing to sociologist. Why did you get into policing and why did you leave?
Well, Justin, first of all, thanks so much for agreeing to moderate this event, and thanks to the Niskanen Center for putting it on. I got into policing back in the early 90s. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the East Bay. Crime was high, and I got into policing for the same reasons that I think most young people do. That is, I wanted to make my community safer and do what I could to help people. And then I had a sort of a secondary goal of trying to work within the system to make it more fair and more equitable. So I didn't have any cops in my family. It was an unusual career choice for me. My dad worked for the university, but I was interested in this in high school. I worked for several police departments part-time, including as a dispatcher when I was going through college. Graduated from UC Berkeley. Got sent to the police academy in Sacramento, and then worked on the street for a relatively short time, just about 11 months. Was really interesting, learned a lot, had a lot of interesting experiences for sure. But I felt that I, in the end, was probably able to make more of a difference as a scholar of policing than as a cop on the ground. And so I left for a career in sociology, very different. I didn't study policing for the first couple of decades of my career. And I only came back to it relatively recently in 2015 when I decided, the time was really ripe to go back and try to work on a book that could maybe do something to change the nature of the conversation around policing in this country.
Gotcha. So the book asks the question, what should we do about police? There are some really riveting and instructive scenes involving officers doing the job and what's going through their head, mixed with studies and data. I found the studies reference to be very important to understanding how all these things layer on top of each other. Towards the end, you write, the challenges this country faces in getting the professional, equitable, and humane policing it needs are formidable. But we can't write off the police, not in the foreseeable future. So tell us about the genesis for how this book came about.
Look, there are something like 750,000 police officers in this country working at thousands of different police departments. And, many officers do their jobs professionally and well, treat citizens with respect. We all know of far too many instances, though, where that's not the case. And I started this book because I was teaching a class at Colby College about the police, and we'd read books that not only describe the studies that you mentioned, some of which I touch on in the book, but we'd read books about the serious problems with policing, from brutality to racial inequalities to problems with dealing with those with mental illness. And my students would come out of the class feeling, I think, a bit depressed and fatalistic, as though there was nothing that could be done. And they would sometimes ask me, are there examples of departments that are doing things right? And we spend a lot of time, in particular, focusing on policing culture. Make the argument in the book on the basis of a fair bit of research that it's one thing to change policy, but if you don't also change the culture of policing, that those norms, values, the us versus them mentality, don't take flack from anyone in the street, those kinds of things, then the policy changes won't necessarily stick on the ground. So my students would ask me, are there any examples of departments that have changed cop culture? And I didn't really know of any. so I started the book project to try to find out whether there were some, with the idea that if there were, maybe those agencies could be models for others around the country.
Gotcha. And again, referencing those studies, I was really interested to read the historical studies of police culture and behavior. It kind of feels like this is something that's been looked at more closely in recent years and decades, but really there was some really important studies from the 50s, the 60s that looked at culture and behavior. All the time I hear in East and West Baltimore, people harken back to the good old days of officer friendly, but these studies were interested in showing that there's long been a problem with policing attitudes and their role in the community. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. The studies of policing that have been done have corresponded with, I would say, waves of public concern about policing. And there have been many of those waves historically, right? There was a big wave at the end of the 19th century when there was a great deal of concern about corruption and the use of the third degree on the part of police departments. Moving a little bit forward in the 20th century, tremendous concern with the connections between policing, the Ku Klux Klan, racism, particularly in the South, lots of public concerns there. And then moving forward, there have been subsequent waves, including a very significant wave of public concern and outcry that followed all the unrest in urban America in the late 60s and the policing of protests, the often quite poor policing of protests that was engaged in during that time. So out of this, there were lots of commissions that were formed, and lots of academic research took up the question of how might we change policing. And this was true in the US. It was also true in other countries. And much of this research focused on the subculture of the police. The argument in these studies was that wherever you found police, there were elements of the subculture that were similar. Again, this us versus them mentality, the notion of not taking flak from anyone on the street, the idea that policing is this intrinsically dangerous job, which of course it is in many respects. And this culture was seen initially to be pretty much universal, right? The same wherever you went, and helping to account for some of the patterns in poor police behavior that scholars observed, patterns of police violence and whatnot. But then in the late 60s, there was a really interesting and important study by the political scientist James Q. Wilson, which was the first to recognize that actually there was variation in police culture from department to department. And from there on out, scholars and of course practitioners as well began to interest themselves in the question of how could you generate even more of that variation, and how could you point policing culture in a better direction.
Yeah, it's not so much an issue of trying to get things back to the way some good old day, but fixing it. It's long been broken, and we're sort of becoming more aware of those things. So you focused on 3 departments that you found were walking the walk. Let's talk briefly about each one. What did you find? Why did you pick Stockton, and what did you find when you looked closer?
Well, I selected these cities through a long process, crunched a bunch of numbers, looked at data, talked to lots of experts, and I'd asked them, tell me some departments that are doing well. And that question was often met with silence. It was a lot easier for people to mention departments that were doing poorly than ones that were doing well, but some eventually bubbled up. And Stockton came to the surface because it was an example of an agency that had tried a set of reforms that other departments had also experimented with around the same time, but seemed to have leaned into them much more than those other departments. So Eric Jones could talk much more about this, but Stockton, mid-sized city, about 320,000 in the Central Valley. It's about an hour east of the San Francisco Bay Area. Long-standing gang violence problem there. It's blue-collar, vibrant blue-collar community, and also, I will say, a department with a long history of brutality against its residents. So the story, it's interesting telling the story with Eric sitting here, but I will say that he took the helm in 2012. Stockton had suffered mightily during the financial crisis. Many houses in Stockton were underwater. The city was one of the first cities in the U.S. to declare bankruptcy. There was a huge decline in tax revenue. And as a result of this, the department had to lay off about 100 of its officers, so about a quarter of its force. And there's the idea is sometimes circulated in the U.S. that there's no relationship between the size of a police force and how much crime there is. That's wrong. In fact, there's a quite strong relationship. And as the Stockton Police Department lost officers, and combined with the economic tumult of the financial crisis, the murder rate in Stockton increased dramatically. So Eric ascended to the position of chief and tried initially to tamp down crime, and found that it was very hard to do that unless he did some serious work to restore and build trust between police and the citizenry. So he leaned into a philosophy called procedural justice. Happy to talk more about that. And made over the course of his 10 years with the department some real headway, measurable headway. The Urban Institute had done a series of studies, for example, that showed dramatic change over a short time in the perceptions of some of the poorest Stockton residents in their trust in the police. So other departments had tried procedural justice, had tried to do this trust building work. Minneapolis had tried it, Chicago tried it, but Stockton tried it, and unlike other places, was able to actually succeed to some degree.
And tell us a little bit about what procedural justice entails.
Sure. So this is a philosophy of policing and crime that's been around for some time. The basic idea is that citizens are more likely to cooperate with the law, and that includes obeying the law and cooperating with authorities in the case of the reporting of a crime, if they believe that the law is just and equitable, if the procedures that the law is following are just and equitable. So applied to policing, that means that the police have to do a lot more to both be fair and equitable in their treatment of citizens and to demonstrate to citizens in their interactions that they're being fair and equitable. And it also means giving citizens voice, allowing people on the street to talk about what's the situations that they're facing, and also allowing people in the community to have real input into what happens in law enforcement. So Eric heard about this philosophy from somebody who was already doing some work with the Stockton Department, and sent many of his officers to receive training in it. And they came back to Stockton, and they developed a series of trainings that every officer in the department was cycled through. And in addition, he did other things. He organized conversations between citizens in Stockton and the police, where citizens would talk about challenges that they'd faced. Prominent historian Elizabeth Hinton came in and gathered information about historical cases where the Stockton police had mistreated people. That information was conveyed to officers. So a whole variety of things, including building procedural justice into officer evaluations, that over the course of time began to shift the needle on police culture in the department.
One of the great things you do in the chapters on Stockton, as well as all the others, is you take a look at individual officers and sort of give a sketch of who they are, why they got into it, why they bought into this type of philosophies and training. But we'll come back to that. The next city that you looked at was Longmont.
Longmont.
Sorry, in Colorado. Tell us why this department and its chief stood out.
Yeah, so I'll tell you why I first got interested in Longmont. I was in my backyard in Maine, and I was on the phone talking to various chiefs, and I was talking to a chief there, Mike Butler, who's sort of came to know, kind of tall, lanky guy, sounds a little bit more like a professor than a cop. And he said, one of the things I'm trying to do in Longmont is separate the police department from the criminal justice system. And I said, what on earth does that mean? I have to go to Longmont and figure it out. So I went there, and what stood out to me about Longmont was that it's a very different kind of community than Stockton, in the sense that Eric has made wonderful changes to that department. The changes in Longmont are really changes that many, I think, progressive activists are calling for now for many departments, except Mike Butler, the chief there, had been making those changes for years and years before the current conversations got underway. Mike was concerned with many things. One of the big things that he was concerned about was mass incarceration. That is the very large number of people in the U.S. And in Colorado as part of that who are in jail or prison and who are there for a very long period of time. And Mike recognized that certainly some people need to be taken out of the community for the safety of the community. But he also recognized that in too many cases, people were being imprisoned for long periods for minor offenses. and or for offenses for which they might be better dealt with in some other way. So he got interested in something called restorative justice. Now, that's a philosophy that's a little bit different than procedural justice. It's a philosophy that now lots of schools are talking about embracing. And the idea there is that you might bring an offender together with a victim, if the victim's willing, in a sort of circle where the offender is asked to apologize for what they did, in a process where the offender is asked to pay restitution, usually, in which there's some kind of significant educative component, and in which the offender is led to realize exactly the nature of the harms that they've caused and to think about why they engage in this behavior. Restorative justice has a long history. There's really good experimental evidence out of the UK that offenders who are subject to restorative justice process re-offend less than offenders who are incarcerated. And there's also good evidence that restorative justice does a good job of reducing post-traumatic stress disorder for victims of violent crimes. So there are lots of county departments, whether DAs or state prison systems, that use some version of restorative justice kind of at the further down end of the justice system. In Longmont, Mike decided that it would be really interesting to partner with a community program. And he developed a system whereby in Longmont, the cops don't have to arrest somebody for a minor offense. So for example, if a kid shoplifts a cheap piece of jewelry, they don't have to arrest them. If they think that those kids might be eligible, might be helped by a restorative justice process, which they also use in adults, by the way, they can steer them into this community-run program. There's no formal record of their having been arrested, and the process has worked really well. Something like 6,000 people have gone through it during the course of his time there. So this was one set of changes that Mike made. But more importantly, I think, or at least as importantly, he also embraced a new ethos for the department, one that really stressed the importance of de-escalation, humaneness, social responsibility. And I saw that on the streets of Longmont again and again. It was a really palpable set of changes. So a whole series of changes to implement, including dialing back enforcement of narcotics laws, but a very different set of changes than those that Eric got behind in Stockton.
Gotcha. And then the third was LaGrange in Georgia. This is a bit different. Yes, you believe the chief there is committed to reform as well, but you highlighted his effort to reckon directly with something terrible from the city's past. Can you talk about what you found there?
Yeah. Well, LaGrange is a very different case. It's a city of about 30,000 people, an hour outside of Atlanta, near the Alabama state line. The city's about half Black and half white. And there, a conservative chief, a guy named Lou Dekmar, came in and tried to bring a department that once was kind of manifestly racist up to more professional standards. This was a community that had just a terrible history and present of racism. Two things stand out to me. One, when I was down there not too long ago, I had a conversation with a retired officer, Black officer, who served in the 1970s, and he told me that when he was first hired, he was told quite clearly that he was not allowed to pull over and ticket white drivers, which was remarkable. And this was also a city that, until the early 90s, had de facto segregated recreational facilities for young people. So this chief Dekmar came, recognized that there was a lack of professional training in the department, that standards were low, and he's part of a movement that aims to bring the many, many thousands of police departments in the US up to national and even international specifications. So he began to change policies and procedures. Unlike the other agencies, the LaGrange Police Department is not unionized, so it wasn't as hard for him to get rid of bad officers. And he began to make these changes, and the department ended up becoming one that was very, very rule-bound, and officers would sometimes complain about it, but it utterly changed the way they behaved on the street. And then, not too many years ago, he came across a case. Some women had come into the police department, and one of his captains overheard one of them say of the police, referring to something in the distant past, "They killed our people," and he launched an investigation to figure out what he was talking about, what they were talking about, because he wasn't aware of any recent cases like that on his watch. And he, working with others in the community, began uncovering a terrible crime, a lynching that had occurred in 1940, in which the police department was complicit. And through a long process, Chief Dekmar ended up apologizing very publicly for his department's role in that lynching. Now, he wasn't the only person involved in this apology. It was a result of a community-led effort at racial reconciliation. But it ended up being a really transformative moment for the town, and it helped to solidify the culture that he helped put in place in the department, which really emphasized respect for rules, for equity, and for humaneness. And I'll just say, I was quite interested to see. I looked at the various statistics for the various departments in many communities across the country. When it comes to just one kind of police behavior, traffic stops, Black Americans are stopped at a disproportionately high rate relative to white Americans, and this was still true in LaGrange, but much less so than in other agencies around the country. So just one kind of very tangible piece of evidence that the changes that Dekmar made were beginning to have an effect.
Gotcha. Just a reminder again for people listening, watching, if you want to put questions in the chat, we will pose them later. In my career covering Baltimore police, I've been covering them since about 2008. Every police commissioner that I covered said they were fixing the department, and they said the guy before them did a lousy job, but they were fixing it up, and they could point to metrics and initiatives, and things would still happen. And you wonder to what extent. Well, things will happen, but overall, this department's moving in the right direction, perhaps. And then things happen that sort of rip the covers off of that, and we get the Justice Department civil rights investigation and the country's task force, and really not just the sort of cartoonish corruption that was exposed, but the everyday violations, the kind of stuff that was going on just right under the nose of everybody and was happening regularly. What degree of skepticism did you have, and perhaps continue to have, regarding a chief who says, I've fixed this police department?
I think anybody who says I've fixed this police department is either has something to hide or doesn't know what they're talking about. Policing is a very, very complex operation, and one lesson that I've taken from studying these three agencies is that getting policing to be better, to be more humane, more equitable, also just better in terms of solving crimes, producing safety. It takes tremendous energy, and it takes constant vigilance from the top to make sure that agencies are run in manners that are transparent, that are equitable, that are rule bound. And backsliding is always a possibility. There's often a disconnect between what chiefs think is happening in an agency and what's actually happening on the ground. Sometimes there are information bottlenecks that keep knowledge of that from flowing upwards. So you can produce better policing. You can produce policing that is, as I said, more humane, more equitable, and so on. But it takes a tremendous investment of resources from the top and tremendous energy. And it's hard to do in a couple of years, right? In all three of these cases, the chiefs had 10 years in the case of Eric Jones, more than 2 decades for Chief Dekmar and Chief Butler. It's a slow process. Police departments are big ships and they're slow to turn, but they can turn.
And the book strikes I think a hopeful tone, but you don't sugarcoat other things. You point out the problems. You point out some continued flaws even in these departments. I feel like it's a scary proposition, though, this notion that we're asking people not to kill people, we're asking people to not violate people's rights, and that it's this really tenuous sort of shaky thing that you said can backslide. I mean, I don't know if I have a particular question there, but this notion that sort of we're one false move away from this all toppling seems to be an indictment of a continued indictment of policing.
Yeah, I certainly see that. I mean, I think one reason that I wanted to focus in the book not just on the chiefs, but to really dive into the stories of individual officers who were trying to implement these changes on the ground is that it's very hard to evaluate outside the department kind of how a department's doing, right? And there's an interesting kind of parallel process, right? On the one hand, cops often suffer in the sense that they are only called to people who are experiencing the worst day of their lives. So they may not know a community very well other than through the 911 calls that they respond to. So they may come to very wrong-headed and sometimes downright dehumanizing judgments about the people in the communities they police. On the other hand, those of us outside the world of policing, very often all we see are the bad things that happen. And we don't see officers who are actively struggling to do the right thing and sometimes succeeding and sometimes not, but trying to deal with the messy complexity of the job that they've been given. And I wanted to bring some of that complexity to light so that people would have a better sense for just what the job looks like and what it entails, even in agencies that are trying to do the right thing. I think in terms of the question you posed, whether this is an edifice that can collapse at any moment. I think what that suggests to me is that what we need to do really in this country is upgrade the policing institution in many respects, right? We need an upgrade of personnel. We need upgrades in terms of training. We need, I think, a substantial investment in resources that would help departments innovate and change their cultures. In many respects, we need a significant upgrading. We need to get policing to the point where that kind of collapse is not going to happen. Right now, there are some hopeful signs in some departments, but we're nowhere near turning the whole ship around.
Gotcha. And you would acknowledge this in the book, but these departments are sort of on the smaller side. Is this scalable to larger organizations, more urban police departments?
I think that's a great question. I guess I do want to point out, something like 90% of police departments in the country are pretty small.
Absolutely.
But of course, there are many millions of people who live in really large departments, and I'm here in New York, and so I've been thinking a lot about that question of scale. I think that's a challenge. One of the things that I found in all three of these departments was that moving forward with police culture required some degree of personal trust between officers, command staff, and the chiefs. And that's harder to obtain at a larger scale, right? Because there are just many more officers and much more distance that separates chiefs from officers. I think that one way to possibly solve this problem is for very large departments to devolve more responsibilities for innovation down to precinct level commanders, and to ask those commanders to not simply be followers of orders from the top, but instead people who are going to be sensitive to community demands, who are going to be open to new ways of policing, who are going to be part of the same conversations that I think all three of these chiefs were, and to have those responsibilities take place at the precinct level so that you can still achieve some more of that trust. I think there are some scattered examples of this, including a few examples of this in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department and elsewhere. But I think that scalability question is one that one that we'll still need to work out.
Yeah, I think there's chiefs fall into a couple of different categories. One being they don't think reform's necessary. There's others who understand it, but can't or won't press it down to the lower ranks, and those who who are able to do that. So that's probably a good time to bring in former Chief Jones, again, formerly of the Stockton Police Department, now Deputy County Executive in Sacramento. Talk to us about how you found procedural justice and why you thought it was something that could work.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I was police chief as Neil mentioned, in Stockton for about 10 years, which candidly is beyond the standard shelf life for a police chief. But, I think we all realize, Neil mentioned, to move that ship of police culture takes some pretty steady leadership for a significant amount of time, I believe, and or passing the torch off to someone who will continue those same efforts. So I did take over Stockton PD at a very difficult time, which I sometimes would call the negative trifecta of several things all coming together at one time, which we were the first city prior to Detroit to declare bankruptcy. So we had major staffing cuts. About a quarter of our force had to be cut through the bankruptcy. And then additional police officers were sort of fleeing the department because of the unknowns of what bankruptcy means for a city and the instability. So we were just leaving, they were leaving in droves. So our staffing went to the lowest staffing we really had in recent memory per capita. And then also at that same time, violent crime was skyrocketing. So we had the highest amount of homicides we ever had. So for a city of a bit over 300,000 to have 71 homicides is an extremely high level. And it wasn't just the homicides, it was gun violence, in particular shootings, gang related mostly. So all these things were all happening at the same time. And during all of that, we lost two big things, which is a lot of morale within the department was really low. And a lot of the trust between police and community was really strained at that time. Part of it was because we just were not policing the community well based on that low staffing. And we were really just 911 responders. We quit going to community meetings. We quit doing all of that stuff. Part of it out of necessity, part of it probably not the best decision to do, which is to say, hey, community, we don't have time for you right now. We're just handling 911 calls. Really, that's when you need your community bridges and partnerships the most, which we learned and corrected. But all of these things, again, were going on. And we had some very controversial police incidents with police force or police shootings. So we had very large amounts of protests at that time. So really, what was needed was some sense of direction. I believe the police department just didn't have a sense of direction at that time. So it really came down to, we are going to focus on gun violence primarily, because all of the issues that police have to address were very important, but the amount of killings, gang killings, or just homicides and shootings in general, that was top priority. So we actually went to even fewer police service calls so we could take our very limited resources and put toward this thing called or a ceasefire. And it's called different things, different places, but it's essentially gun violence intervention efforts, which Stockton did at one time, by the way, about a decade prior, but due to politics or changing in mayors, changing of city managers, there was just, hey, let's go on and do something new or different. That is something I do find police leaders and community leaders need to resist, which is following the shiny, not the shiny object, but just following the new thing that the new politician or person wants to do. Gun violence intervention efforts are difficult. They're difficult to sustain. It takes a lot of work, but we went back to ceasefire, which is really the Boston model, but of course modified for Stockton. And it required, again, we had about the lowest budget you could get and about the lowest staffing you could get, but you don't need budget or staffing to focus on a particular issue. You just restructure what you do have to make it work, which we did. So we went back to ceasefire, which I believe is about the most evidence-based gun violence intervention effort there is for the type of group gun violence that we saw in our city and some other cities across the country. So during that endeavor, the folks that I partnered with the California Partnership for Safe Communities, Stuart Winkling, Von Crandall, they were helping us roll out and do better ceasefire, which to retain program fidelity takes a lot of work. You'll find a lot of places say, oh, we're doing a group violence intervention effort, or we're doing ceasefire, but they're really not all the time.
We like it so much in Baltimore, we tried it 4 times.
Yeah. And it takes work, and it takes somebody to really drive the work. And to, it's that balance between law enforcement and your community partners and your outreach workers. And so during that, I was first, somebody pitched the idea, actually Stuart Wakeling, of, hey, there's this thing called PJ, procedural justice, that's really, it's not new, but it's kind of new for a lot of other departments outside of, the work that Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler are working on. And it fits with what we're trying to do with ceasefire, which is respectful communication with these guys that we know are driving our gun violence. They're either highest at risk of being shot or shooting someone. And if you message those that are most at risk in a respectful way, which they're not typically accustomed to being communicated with in a respectful way by law enforcement, you can actually get some pretty good results. So that really cracked open the door for me to have a high level of interest in it. It was actually trying to reduce serious gang gun violence in our community that led me to this thing called procedural justice, which I became a true believer in. And as the book outlines, getting the department to buy into it was a lot of work, but I feel like we were mostly successful with that.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that jumped out to me, was sort of this idea that I think it's said that, you know, you're afraid of alienating your officers, and you sort of got to take like these gentle steps towards this. And that's such a striking thing. I mean, these are your employees. These are people who work for you. You're the boss. You know, they're getting paid by taxpayers, and yet there's this very gentle way you have to approach people. You don't want to alienate them and have them give up and rebel. And can you talk about just the sensitivities and the way that you can go about this so that people do buy into it and do what you ask them to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think a lot of that was just kind of watching and observing and learning myself on how not to do things, which means whatever the new shift in culture, because really, if you're adopting procedural justice, it's not a program, it's not a checklist training thing to do. You need to infuse it into your culture, and that's no easy task. Otherwise, you know, the personnel will go, your staff will go through the training. They'll say, yeah, these policies are new policies, but you know, as is stated also in the book, is culture eats policy and training for lunch every day. I mean, so to infuse in the culture takes quite a bit. And this was a new thing for Stockton PD. It was a big shift. And I had seen in other places or other things we tried to do in our agency prior, where we roll out this thing, and if the staff don't buy into it, and of course you're never going to get all of your staff to buy into it, but if you get your staff to buy into it on the front end, it's going to have a much higher rate of success. And I recall a rule called the 80-20 rule, which is, you know, about 80% as a leadership model. You know, there's always going to be your 10% that you're never going to bring along. I mean, you're just not, right? And then you have the other 10% that you just have them. They're going to follow you no matter what. Well, that's a large group in between that you can influence and or direct or bring into it. And that was my target audience. So, you know, the 10% that didn't want to buy into it, go to another department, stop doing police work. That's great, right? And we have disciplinary tools to handle you if you're not going to do it. But I really needed to influence that, you know, really the definition of leadership is influence the others to follow me on this new thing. So I spent a lot of time before really working with the community, or I would say parallel tracks. I spent a lot of time internal within the police department explaining what it was, to demystify it, to explain to them, this is really why you signed up to do police work.
Right.
There's just a now, you know, most of you do this anyway, but there's actually a name for it. And, you know, to also bring in the implicit bias training, to bring in that this actually reduces cynicism, which it's not a matter of if you'll become cynical as a police officer, it's a matter of when, really, because of the work you do. This gives you tools to help you combat that cynicism, to be healthy in your life, to be healthy in your career. And so but you did mention, you know, the fact that I took some incremental, what I believe are some sort of strategic steps. I did take it, and some would argue, and I think, you know, I was criticized somewhat, and I'm okay with that, for moving a little too slow within the department. But my belief is there's that delicate balance of, if you move too fast, you lose folks, right? And that goes to the, hey, I'm going to lead 1 to 2 steps out in front of the department versus 5, 6, 7 steps out. You look behind and no one's following you anymore. They've lost faith in their leader. I've seen some agencies where they attempted procedural justice in, you know, maybe too fast, maybe too much, perhaps arguably. And the unions were perhaps so powerful that they ran out their own police chief. That happens. So I actually brought my police union on with this work. But again, it took a lot of time and already built relationships to be able to do that.
I want to talk to you about so-called proactive policing. And you know, it's associated with a lot of some of the worst things that we see across the country, some of the worst violations. And yet, it seems police departments can't live without it. That they continue to see it as a very important part of crime fighting. There's a scene in the book where the officer, whose first name is Drake, and I can't remember his last name, but he's one of the officers who's featured.
Drake Weist.
Yes, he's one of the officers featured as doing things the right way. But he makes a pretextual stop of a suspected gang member. He rolls a stop sign. He's got his kid in the car after going for a haircut. And the next thing you know, he's cuffed and the car is being searched. Now, this is portrayed as sort of being done with care and respect. But I think some will still view that stop and search itself as harassment. Can you talk about sort of how proactive policing continues to exist and sort of how it is maybe, a delicate thing as you're trying to win over that trust and reform?
It is a delicate thing. And, proactive teams, I am a believer in, but how those proactive teams operate is the critical key here. So, for example, I'll go back to when I was a young police officer on the streets, and I was actually part of one of our proactive teams in the early mid 90s. We did things differently then. I was what I would consider a good cop, meaning I did what my commanders and chief wanted me to do. Make a whole lot of arrests, especially for drugs. Was this part of why we had disparate arrests and mass incarceration? Yes, right. But that's what police departments across the country were doing, was proactive hotspot policing, if you will, putting a whole lot of police officers in these zones, high crime zones throughout the city, which are typically going to be your areas of people of color, most commonly, especially in Stockton. I'll speak for Stockton. And we were told to do zero tolerance policing. I don't remember what we called it at the time. Of course, I think it was called zero tolerance at a certain period, which is pretty much enforce everything on everybody within that community. And the theory was you'll drive crime down. And I knew intuitively at the time, this doesn't feel right, but I was a good police officer doing what I was told to do. And yes, you can drive down crime doing that style of policing for a very short amount of time, because I think some of the research shows it actually will go up, because while you're doing that type of policing, you're driving down community trust. So then you're getting less folks that are coming forward and sharing information, less community members, willing to work with you, and it actually, street justice can prevail, because they don't have any faith within their own police department anymore. And so that was proactive policing. Now, the type of proactive policing we shifted to was away from that model. It was about, first going into the community and working with community members on how do you want to be policed, right? Because I learned a lot of these neighborhoods wanted to see police officers. They wanted police in their neighborhood. I think there's a myth that some of the communities with high violent crime don't want police in their communities. That was not my experience. They wanted us there, but the community wanted a voice into how they were policed. Don't stop us for every little thing. Grandma going to the corner market to get milk and her taillights out, and they pull her over, search the car, right? So it's about applying procedural justice to proactive policing. And I think you saw some examples of some officers that we feel, did it right. Because the other argument is, if we don't do any proactive policing, we're not going to get as many guns off the street, illegal guns off the street. So again, you mentioned the word delicate. I would completely agree with that. It is delicate, but that's why it has to be discussed, that balance. That's why it has to be discussed within the police department at all ranks, all the time. And I would argue that the sergeant, which is a first line supervisor in policing typically, is the most powerful position within a police department. Meaning your chief can have a great policy and training, and even your top management might believe in it. But if the sergeants are out there supervising these street level officers every day, all the time, so their buy-in on shaping these proactive teams while still applying procedural justice is critical.
Yeah, you mentioned that people by and large are crying out for more police. The Baltimore Banner, which is the nonprofit news site that I work for now, we did a survey last year, and 73% of residents said they supported money being allocated from the police budget to mental health and social and drug treatment programs, but 72% said they wanted an increase in police presence and patrols, which really can only be done by increasing the budget. And that, I guess, dovetails into the last question that I have for you before we get to the audience questions. I'm not done yet, people. I have one more. There was an NPR story over the weekend out of New Orleans talking about how defunding the police didn't really happen. There was calls for it, but it didn't happen. But that effectively the current staffing crisis that we're seeing, where people are leaving departments in droves, they're not able to recruit people to replace them, has effectively shrunk those departments and limited what they can do, which I think also threatens to undermine their effectiveness, which then in turn could make the case for defunding, that if you're not doing a good job with the resources we're giving you, why should we keep giving them to you? Do you have brief thoughts on just sort of where we are and how that's all gonna play out?
Yeah, so the defunding police conversation was and is a very interesting one, because that means when you say that defunding of the police, it means something different to almost everybody you speak to. But certainly, I think I used to think of it in a way as maybe we can reallocate some resources to more fund those things that we all don't really need police to do anymore, right? We kind of moved in sort of American policing model to police responded to everything. If somebody's in crisis, perhaps a mental health, behavioral health crisis or substance abuse issue, we kind of just figure police are the answer to everything. You'll find that most police officers will support sending mental health counselors and other workers to types of calls that they might not necessarily need to go to, because it frees them up to do other things and have better response times to very serious crimes. But we are seeing police departments and sheriff's agencies shrink everywhere. And a lot of it is not, I don't necessarily believe, because counties and cities are shrinking their budget. It's because they're just seeing these huge vacancies also. But it goes back to, and if I go back to my example when we went through bankruptcy, very low staffing, but it's about prioritization of what really matters. And for us, it was addressing gun violence and increasing community trust, and just remodeling and retooling what we really should be responding to and what we should not need to respond to.
Yeah, one of the things we're seeing in Baltimore is that the consent decree team sort of did a study of the agency and said, you need this amount of officers in order to be able to have them spend their time getting to know the community and responding to calls. And we're down about 500 officers, and it doesn't seem like that is going to be turned around anytime soon. And I wonder how that's going to affect these goals for reform and these benchmarks they're supposed to meet. Let's get to some audience questions. The first one in the chat here, and I guess these are for either of you. What are your thoughts on the code of silence in policing, i.e. the idea that officers feel loyal to fellow officers to the extent where officers may not report the misconduct of their peers? Is that prevalent? And if so, how can supervisors and management work to resolve this? Neil, you go first.
Sure. I think some version of that is quite prevalent. How far it extends, I think, varies from department to department and even from officer to officer, right? I think it wouldn't be uncommon to find officers feeling like they had to back up their fellow cops, and if that meant perhaps seeing something a particular way on a minor matter, I think probably many cops will go along with that. I think as it gets to kind of more serious violations, you're going to see a lot more variation in terms of how willing cops are to do that. I will say that that for all the conversations about the effects of body cam footage, and for all the studies that show that it's not reduced police violence as much as money would have liked, I think body cameras have utterly transformed the profession. When I was on the force and when Eric started, it was a very different kind of job in the sense that most of it was done in private between you and the person that you're stopping, and maybe there's someone else around, a few witnesses. Maybe somebody would come by. In Berkeley, there were people who sometimes would come by with video cameras, but that was rare. And so there was a lot more opportunity and potential for cops to enact this code of silence and essentially to lie or otherwise tell untruths on reports. I think that the capacity is being reduced. And so I would expect, as more and more departments really lean heavily into body cam footage, and as that body cam technology moves in new directions, in particular toward things like streaming body cams, and also toward the use of AI algorithms to kind of figure out, in real time what's going on, I would expect the effect of that code of silence to be reduced. But I think it can be changed. Certainly in some of the departments that I studied, LaGrange in particular, those cops were afraid of that chief and of any violation of the rules. So I remember one call, it was not an officer I profiled in the book, but it was just a call that would normally require a very fast police response, and he started driving, and he hit a speed limit. I think it was like 35 miles an hour or something like that. And he's like, for calls like this, chief does not allow us to drive more than 35 miles an hour. And that was just one of many, many examples. They had to wear ties. They couldn't wear sunglasses when talking to citizens for fear it would show disrespect. And they were worried that if they violated those rules, they'd be found out and their pay would be docked, or maybe they'd be let go. So you can build a very rule-based department that will counter that sort of natural tendency of policing.
Gotcha. I don't know if Chief Jones wanted to address that.
Yeah, I agree with Neil. Does it exist? I mean, yes, it does. And so I think if a police leader says it doesn't exist, then they're either overly naive or not being truthful. It's to what level, really, or what is the department? But I do want to back up. That's a standard human behavior, actually, in any profession, or just in general, where you sort of you protect your group, right? Or your professional folks you work with. But anyway, code of silence regarding, lying or covering for other officers. We, of course, like every police department, I would imagine, have policies around that. We did add extra policies on, you have a duty to report misconduct. And if you don't report misconduct that you view in the field, then you'll be disciplined. So I think that was, an important additional policy for us to have. And we did have some cases where that was, we did hold officers accountable for that very thing. I do believe it's a different place now than it was, for example, when I first started. I think we see a lot less of that. Certainly when I was police chief, we had several cases. In fact, I think the majority of our internal affairs complaints were internally generated, which meant it was other officers bringing up misconduct that they viewed that other staff members did. And I think that shows a fairly healthy, path. But again, you can have policies, but it goes back to the culture question: is what's really going on. And I agree that the body-worn camera technology is changing policing forever in a good way. And the one thing I probably wished I would have done sooner in the police department and would be to do actual audits, reviews of officers' body-worn camera to actually, not just wait for a complaint or use of force incidents to happen, but actually go back and do spot checks, which some police departments did. And I think we were just about ready to do that. And I wished I would have done that a little sooner.
All right, we have another question. Neil, I think, I'm not sure how much you've studied consent decrees, but the question is, for departments that are under or have completed federal consent decrees, would you say that is a relatively good indicator that progress will be made in those departments?
So, I think the story with consent decrees is that they've been a mixed bag. In the agencies that have undergone them, you often do see some real tangible change. It's, of course, that tangible change that leads the DOJ and the monitors to back away from the consent decree when they feel that changes have been made. But it's very often the case, or has been the case very often, that when those consent decrees are lifted, things kind of snap back to where they were before. I think for me, this comes back to this question of culture, right? I think that to make changes in policing, you need, again, both policy change, use of force policy, policies around investigative procedure of officer misconduct, all those sorts of things. And consent decrees are super helpful with that. But you also need cultural change, and you can't always mandate that. And it's not always the case that if you change policy, then cultural change will follow. A lot of that cultural change has to come from the inside. It can be informed by things that are happening in the community, but it has to be something that police chiefs come to, and that cops come to follow, and it's something that's very hard for DOJ to mandate. I certainly would like to see departments that are under DOJ supervision do a lot more work on the culture piece. I know some have. That was a big part of the New Orleans model, for example, which I know has been folks have tried to import to Baltimore. I think those efforts have been helpful. We'll see whether they produce real effects in the long term. But I think that at the end of the day, those consent decrees are essential for departments that are really failing. But without that cultural piece, which comes from empowering chiefs to make real transformations, it's not going to yield the long-term results that we're all hoping for.
Yeah. This next question touches on something I thought about a lot while reading the book, which was, and that you're speaking about now, the amount of autonomy that officers have, and just sort of how, there's laws, but when you go out in the field, they can be enforced any number of ways. And it depends on maybe the officer's mood or the political pressure or whatever, that there's so many decisions that can be made that tremendously alter how these things are carried out. So the question is, by and large, how do officers respond to bright line rules that govern their behavior during civilian encounters? Do they appreciate the clarity of what's expected and tolerated, or do they consider them unreasonable restrictions on their discretion?
I mean, I can say that my experience is that it varies. Typical social science answer. Depends on the situation, and it depends on how far out from the rule change you're talking about, right? So oftentimes when those bright line rules are first implemented, you'll get a lot of pushback and a lot of anger. 5 years down the line, it's just part of the way of doing things. One of the focuses in the Longmont chapters of the book is on domestic violence investigations, and that's an area where most police departments around the country have seen a real bright line change, which has been in place for decades now, which is mandatory arrests when there's evidence that domestic violence has taken place. And I think if you look back at studies on that implementation, when those policy changes were first put into place, I think there were certainly officers who were upset about them, about having to arrest an offender when perhaps they thought just informal counseling the parties to separate would be better for whatever reason, whatever misguided reason. And you may still have officers who feel that way, but I think now it's just generally accepted that those arrests are mandatory. So I think it depends.
Chief Jones, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think mostly officers don't want too much ambiguity, and it is a paramilitary organization, so there is sort of sometimes they want a bit of structure, and in certain places it's easier than others. Sometimes a new law or a new legislative act will happen where it really restricts police in a certain area. Typically that does not go over well, just like Neil said, but then over time it's just part of how you do business. But you can also have, I think, too tight of if this, then this rules, because there is so much there. One is use of force, right? One of the most controversial, if you will, pieces of what law enforcement officers have to do. And with my community advisory board, we had a lot of discussions about why we didn't want to get too restrictive, where it took out any discretion at all. So it depends on the type of rule, and it depends on how that rule is rolled out to the department. And it takes a while, the rate of absorption. It takes a while for it to become the new way of doing things.
One last question. I'll sneak in here under the deadline. Quick answers if you can. This question says, would it be crazy to think that the FOP and PBA could be avenues for education on best practices if they can be shown how it helps with morale, retention, training, and good community relations to help demonstrate how culture change can be to the benefit of officers? Between COVID and resistance to racial justice efforts, it seems staffing and morale are huge problems. Everybody wants to know what's in it for me to change.
Well, I'll say very quickly that there's something that's kind of fundamentally wrong about the way we've talked about police reform in this country. It's often talked about as though if you reform the police, that means you're handcuffing them and crime has to go nowhere but up. I think what the data show, and what I've tried to suggest in the book, is that police reform, effective, humane, responsible policing is one of the best strategies you can undertake if the goal is to reduce crime, because that produces the kind of trust between police and citizens that's so essential to both keeping people obeying the law and to fostering that information exchange between law enforcement and the citizenry. So I think making the case that police reform is essential for reducing crime is not only a smart political strategy, whether it's aimed at unions or elsewhere, but it's also just empirically a correct thing to say.
Okay, I think we are out of time. I don't know if we get cut off or whether it's just time to end it, but thank you so much, Neil and Chief Jones, and everybody who tuned in. This will be online for people who want to watch it later. And yeah, thank you. Thanks again, everybody.